干涉中华民族的耳朵，血缘你像这样一般，人人宰割。我们要抱定必上的决心，保护黄河，保护华北，保护全中国。
风在吼，马在叫，孟德在咆哮，黄河在咆哮，热气上浪万丈高，河东河北都要受要万山丛中，唐人生人不少，金沙仗义，有志健儿成英豪，万军的铜墙扬枪，为政治打倒强暴，保卫家乡，保卫黄河，保卫华北，保卫全中国。风在吼，马在叫，黄河在咆哮，黄河在咆哮，热血上抗万丈高，河东河北都要上演万山丛中，抗日圣战出生，金沙仗义，有志健儿成英豪，万军的铜墙扬枪，为政治打倒强暴，保卫家乡，保卫黄河，保卫华北，保卫全中国。风在吼，风在吼，马在叫，黄河在咆哮，黄河在咆哮，黄河在咆哮，热血上抗万丈高，河东河北都要受要万山丛中，唐人生战出生，金沙仗义，有志健儿成英豪，万军的铜墙扬枪，为政治打倒强暴，保卫家乡，保卫黄河，保卫华北，保卫全中国。
Thank you very much. So for people who are just joining, that is a cantata, Defending the Yellow River, which actually was composed, the story goes, by a Chinese composer sitting in a cave during the Japanese invasion of China in 1939. And I participated in that performance, and I have to say I found it exceedingly challenging to get through the words that quickly. But I'd like to welcome everybody to the Sare for Senate New York Symposium. We are celebrating the Chinese New Year, the Year of the Tiger, and we are going to have a wonderful panel of experts and respondents who can share with you some of the history of the actual relationship of the United States and China. Before we get to that, I should just say a few things about where we are in history, because we are actually in an extremely dangerous moment. Many people are aware and nervous about the potential of a war between the US and NATO on one side and Russia on the other side. The ostensible alleged cause of this is Russia's alleged intent to invade Ukraine, which even President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that people should calm down. He doesn't believe it's imminent. And for that, the British are talking about how the Ukrainian people are losing confidence in him, and why doesn't he have more faith in the CIA assessments? I have just written a statement. There are going to be many demonstrations tomorrow all over the United States against war with Russia over Ukraine. And I think I can pull it up here. I have written a short statement which is available on my website with the title, Truth is the First Casualty of War. A new paradigm is required to avert catastrophe. And what I take up at the beginning, people may have heard that Ned Price of the State Department claims that Russia is planning to, quote, make a video with graphic scenes of false explosions depicting corpses, crisis actors pretending to be mourners, and images of destroyed locations or or military equipment, unquote, in order to justify an invasion of Ukraine. In other words, you have the United States accusing Russia of staging a false flag incident. Now, the very dangerous part about this is that if NATO were to launch a preemptive attack on Russia, that this story would be used to say that Russia was faking it and we really didn't attack them. Now, happily, in the press conference, a journalist from Associated Press, Matt Lee, actually challenged Ned Price on where was the evidence for this, of which, of course, Ned Price could not come up with any. And I think people should be fairly accustomed, unfortunately, to the idea that we, as John Brennan of the CIA said, we don't do evidence. So we are risking a nuclear war. We heard lies about the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which led to the death of 1 million or more Iraqis. But Russia is a nuclear power. This is exceedingly dangerous. I would encourage people to take copies of this. You can look online for Code Pink, who is the main sponsor of these demonstrations, and get this out. What I take up there is that while Russia is legitimately and rightfully demanding written treaty agreements from the US and NATO that NATO will not continue to expand and jeopardize the second strike deterrent option, that treaties don't tend to actually prevent war. You have to change your relationship to each other, and the best way to do that is to have a common shared mission. In this case, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, has proposed is that China, Russia, the United States, and all of the nations surrounding Afghanistan, be it Tajikistan, Iran, Pakistan, others, also India has played a major role in the region, have an interest in Afghanistan becoming a stable, functioning nation. Right now, in that country, according to the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, 55% of the population, or 23 million people, are facing imminent starvation. 7 million children are on the brink of dying of starvation. 1 million of those are in a condition described as so severe that observers say in the West, these children would be in the intensive care unit. So if you don't want this nation to starve to death or to become so destabilized that it explodes into terrorism and drug trafficking, then it is in our interest and the interest of these other nations to ensure that something is done to alleviate these conditions. And what Mrs. LaRouche called for is a project named after Ibn Sina, Project Ibn Sina, the brilliant philosopher and physician born in 980 AD in the region of Afghanistan. His father was from that area specifically, and he made many, many discoveries in medical science, including cancer, diabetes, and the use of quarantine to stop the spread of disease. So what more appropriate project than to name after him this effort and to bring the nations in a common mission, which not only could save the lives of 23 million people, but would be an exercise to establish trust among these nations that right now are on the brink of war. Now, as people may have heard, the leaders of China and Russia were meeting today on the sidelines of the Beijing Olympics. Putin and Xi Jinping, I'm sure they are going to be making all kinds of economic agreements of significance. According to the London Guardian, they signed a joint statement calling on the West to, quote, abandon the ideologized approaches of the Cold War. The parties oppose the further expansion of NATO, call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon the ideologized approaches of the Cold War respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilizational and cultural historical patterns, and treat the peaceful development of other states objectively and fairly, unquote. So I'm sure we'll be hearing more from this. Apparently, there were 20 heads of state in Beijing currently, which will create an opportunity to discuss exactly this project, including Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Egypt, Serbia, Argentina, and others. So we are really in an extraordinary circumstance, and I think it is high time for the United States to return to its original founding intent, which is a bulwark of freedom and liberty against the British Empire and against British colonial imperial policies, emphatically including the idea of divide and conquer, or that somehow the development of another nation is a threat to our own. It actually should be seen as a great benefit to the world and the United States that China has successfully lifted 850 million people out of extreme poverty. And it should be a reason for us to collaborate with China in continuing that policy worldwide, especially in the face of the pandemic, where we see the biggest factor of comorbidity is poverty itself. So with that, let me introduce the speakers, and let me say, as they're being brought up, that participation in the Sare for Senate Symposium does not constitute endorsement of my candidacy. And it also does not mean that I necessarily agree with the views of my speakers, although very often I do. But this is being done because we have to have a dialogue of certain crucial issues facing civilization, and there are too few places where that can occur. So with that said, let me tell you who everybody is. We have with us Richard Black, who's the UN representative of the Schiller Institute, and he will be responding to the main presentations. Leni Rubenstein, who also is with the Schiller Institute, but who actually took it upon herself to found a Chinese language version of the Executive Intelligence Review magazine and our website. And then we have Bob Wesser, a longtime friend and collaborator of mine, who is doing brilliant work in American history and the relationship between the US and China. And we will first hear from Dr. George Koo, who is an international business consultant and a much published writer about China and the United States. So with that, George, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Diane. It's a pleasure to talk to your audience in New York. I'm going to be using 4 slides. 3 of them are very busy, let's just have the title slide, please. And my contention is that there's no reason for China and U.S. to be in an adversarial, unfriendly relationship, and that the 2 countries should really be friends. The next 3 slides I'm going to talk about, I'm going to review what the relationship is like between China and U.S. at the founding of the United States. Next slide, I'm going to talk about the differences between China and the U.S. today. And by implication, in doing that, I will point out why the demonizing, the blackening of China by the U.S. media and the U.S. politicians have no basis in fact. And in the third slide, I will point out that what's in it for the U.S. to get along with China. And then finally, for the last slide, just a sort of for the amusement of the audience, I will show a cartoon, a political cartoon coming from China. So with that, let's go on to the first slide, please. So you may wonder where that expression for all the tea in China come from? Well, I can tell you it really started from the Boston Tea Party. At the time of the Boston Tea Party, most of you may know that the British control the trade of tea from China. And at the time, the British had not yet succeeded in stealing the seedlings of the tea plant to take it to India. So they were not monopolizing the trade of tea from China, and they charged a surcharge tax, which the American colonials were protesting, and that's how the Boston Tea Party started. The tea that they dumped in the harbor of Boston came from China. And one part of it came from Wuyi Mountain, which is a very scenic area of Fujian province. And this is where the famous Tie Guanyin, or Iron Goddess tea, is from. It happens to be my own personal favorite tea too. So as soon as after the American gained independence, with the blessing of George Washington, the first president, they set out Empress of China to Guangzhou in 1784. And this was the beginning of China trade between the U.S. and China. It was, I think this, if I remember, this ship was financed by Morris, who was a very wealthy, living in New Jersey at the time, and he financed it. A crew of 34, 6 months voyage to Guangzhou, and they took with them fur and 30 tons of ginseng, because they knew that the Chinese were very, ginseng is one of the favorite, tonic and herbal supplement for the Chinese people. Excuse me. Unfortunately, the ginseng didn't sell very well because the American ginseng wasn't as good as the Korean ginseng or even the ones in China. But that was the first time. And even with just the fur that they took to China, they were able to make a profit. And from there, for the next 10 years, there would be 70 ships going from the U.S. to Guangzhou to do business. So between 1784 and 1814, in 30 years, U.S. became the second largest trading nation with China after the Great Britain. So, and by 1850, America was importing 30,000 tons of tea per year. Let me remind you that at that point, the world hasn't really discovered coffee. And so tea was the beverage of choice in the West. And it was the most important daily beverage, if you will. And a great deal of money was made by the traders that had this vision of doing business with China. And in fact, one can say that because of the vision of getting rich doing business with China, that it motivated the Louisiana Purchase. It motivated the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore how to get to the other side of the continent and thus become much closer to China in terms of time to get there. At that point, the Chinese population was about 100 times larger than the U.S., and wasn't much question that from the U.S. perception, China was the big brother, the wealthy, upscale country to be doing business with. So then let's move on to the next slide and talk about where we are today. You can see that the two countries are so different in style and in approach that there's nothing in there to suggest, as I go through this, there's nothing in there to suggest that China is set out to be an adversary, to be an enemy, or to be a rival of the United States. You can say they want to compete in different ways, but I also think that there are various ways that they need to collaborate. So let's look at some of these items. Philosophically, China has been the highest priority is to take their citizens out of abject poverty into a better life. And they've been doing this step by step as they build roads and infrastructure and connect the remote areas. Clearly, if they can bring 850 million people out of poverty, they cannot be abusing human rights. They honor the life of the human being. In the U.S., we place great deal of emphasis on how to deny certain people the right to vote, and we place highest priority to carrying arms, and of course, other issues like women's right to determine for themselves. In terms of the government in China, they tend to be more technocrats, engineers. In this country, of course, we are run by lawyers. China has been building a Belt and Road initiative for many years now. The idea is that by lending their expertise on infrastructure building, they can help third world countries with the necessary infrastructure to improve their local economy, to improve the lives of their people. And they do it without interference, without the interference of the domestic affairs of these local governments. They do not tell other people how they should run their country, and they respect the sovereignty of the countries that they work with. This is quite different from the U.S. and other European powers. In the old days, they simply go there and exploit the resources. And after World War II, with the foreign aid that the U.S. is involved in, it always tend to come with conditions. And usually the conditions has to do with how they should govern. China works within the boundaries of the United Nations. U.S. most frequently acts outside of the United States. How the Chinese officials get promoted is based on how they perform at every level along the way. They start from being a party member, running the villages, running cities, become the party secretary of provinces, and they are graded and evaluated as they go on. As we know, in the United States, it's not always the best qualified people that runs the government. It's the people who can raise the most money for campaigning. China, since 2008, understood that to avoid the financial crisis, they invested heavily in infrastructure. They built their high-speed rail. They connected the highways, and thus they averted so-called qualitative or quantitative easing and cheapening their own currency. They lifted China and helped the world escape the economic downturn with their investments. The U.S., of course, with the financial crisis of 2008, practically collapsed and had to go. Hank Paulson had to go to Beijing several times to talk to China about working to stabilize the world economy. And ever since then, they've talked about the importance to invest in infrastructure. But as they talk, bridges keeps collapsing, and nothing much gets done. And certainly, there's still plenty left to be done. In China, they respect science and technology. In the U.S., to respect science and technology practically means that you are anti-God. You are there's great section of the American people that expect creationism to have equal time in the school curriculum. China, of course, has thousands of years of history in their regard for education. In this country, in my opinion, there's bright spots. There's some great schools, but there are also some really mediocre schools that do not get the funding and support from their governments. In terms of the threat to world security, China has always avowed that they will never send the first strike. They just make sure that they have enough capability for retaliatory strikes to make sure that the any other countries with unfriendly intentions will think twice. And of course, the United States have over 800 military bases around the world. They have the first and second island chains surrounding China. They are used to invading Chinese airspace with impunity. They still now send their ships to the South China Sea to quote unquote exercise freedom of navigation for the purpose of threatening China. And lastly, of course, the Chinese respect the sovereignty of all the countries they work with, whereas in the U.S., we expect everybody to follow our leadership. And this is even now, as we know that Secretary Blinken still rallying around to have countries sign up to gang up on China, and not realizing that this is a increasingly difficult chore because the countries are all conflicted. They are doing much more business, much more trading with China than they are with the United States. So let's take a look at the third slide. I just want to point out that working with China can actually help the United States enormously, as I show here in this purple color. Let me just give you a couple examples. China Construction, one of the China construction companies, with their experience in building highways and infrastructure, set up a company in New Jersey. They bid and won the refurbishing of the Hamilton Bridge. Now, all of you in New York probably know about Hamilton Bridge, but in case you don't, it's the bridge, the extension of the George Washington Bridge that crosses over the East River. So the other side, the GW Bridge crosses the Hudson River, and Hamilton goes over the East River. The Hamilton Bridge was the refurbishing and rebuilt and expansion was won by this China construction company. They were the lowest bid. They came in within budget and they came in on schedule. And most of the workers and laborers was local hire, American laborers. The management and the technologists, engineers were supplied by the China side. So that's an example of a win-win arrangement. Even more important is the project of replacing the dilapidated old subway cars in the major cities in China, in the U.S. The Chinese railway rolling stock company from Changchun proposed and won the bid to bring in the siding, the siding and some of the other parts to be assembled in the U.S. to local source the interior, such as air conditioning and so on and so forth, to bring in a local content in excess of 60% American content, so that it qualifies as made in the U.S. The assembly plant, one of them was set up in Massachusetts in Springfield to supply the subway cars in Boston. The other one was outside of Chicago and was to supply Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. The first car that was delivered to Boston amidst a great fanfare because it was state-of-the-art car. It was quieter, it was safer, and it was cheaper. It was, and I should say that the subway cars are not made in the U.S. anymore. there's no U.S. company are making these subway cars. So the bidders were from Korea, from I think Canada, and the Chinese, and the Chinese bid was again lower than the others. So with that success, the Chinese company proposed to set up an office in New York to study the replacement of subway cars in New York and Washington. Now, all of you that have ridden the subway in New York know how old and noisy and rattling it can be. It's over 100 years old. And they were prepared to set up to work with the New York authorities to study the problem and the network and come up with the necessary engineering and design. But at this point, the politicians stepped in. One of whom is Senator Chuck Schumer. He raised the alarm and say, wait a minute, we can't do this. We can't have the Chinese build our subway cars in New York or in Washington because they can very easily spy on us by putting in the hearing devices in these subway cars. Can you imagine, folks, having a conversations as you're going to work and say, hey, Joe, how's your family? You think the Yankees are going to win the pennant tonight, this year? And voila, all that gets sent to Beijing and becomes intelligence to build up this massive amount of data that will enable the Chinese to come up with a multi-head missile and send back to the U.S. It's so patently ridiculous and outrageously moronic, shall we say, that it just beggars the imagination of how desperate and how extreme the American media and the American politicians will go to give China a bad name. I can go on and on that part, but maybe we can do that in the discussion. But I just simply need to point out that there are so many problems in the world that needs the two strongest, most powerful nations collaborating, working together to solve these problems. The refugee and human trafficking, for example, is a big problem around the world. And if we, the United States, stop making forever wars, that will be a first step to reducing refugee flow. But it takes global cooperation, and to have peace and avoid nuclear war. That should be a goal that everybody should be in favor of, rather than building up warheads and trying to count and make sure that we have enough to destroy the world 6 or 7 or 8 times over. The recent COVID experience teaches us and tell us that we can't just seal the disease within our border. We have to deal with it across the world. And it doesn't help to criticize China for their quote unquote draconian measure, while the United States allow the exercise of individual freedom, so that at this point, there's nobody dying in China, and there's about, in any given day, 2,000 or more are dying in the United States. So what does that say about respect for the human life between the U.S. and China? We should think about not investing in more advanced weapons and think about raising everybody's style of living style. And I have to say, we accuse China of developing advanced weapons like hypersonic missile, etc. Well, the only way that they can continue to do a credible second strike capability is to keep up with the U.S. investments. While U.S. have to spend hundreds of billions to develop the budget, it takes a lot less to develop a counter second strike. So again, we are getting the short end of the stick for spending that kind of money. We both, China and the U.S., recognizes the threat of global terrorism, except that all of a sudden, the East Turkestan, I forgot the exact name of the terrorist group that was fighting for the independence of Xinjiang. Everybody agreed they were a terrorist group, and then all of a sudden, Secretary Pompeo said, "Hey, no, they're good guys. We take them off the list unilaterally." Well, that's not going to solve the terrorist problem. Again, climate change is becoming more and more a serious problem, and it requires everybody to be working to reduce the greenhouse gases. And most observations show that China is actually more on schedule in doing their part than we are in the US or some of the other countries. In the end, by working together, we're going to be able to make the whole world wealthier, higher standard of living, peaceful living, and that's how you get more security. You really get security if you're not fighting and threatening each other. So with that, I conclude with the last slide. This is a cartoon from China. They obviously don't know about Uncle Sam, the symbol for Uncle Sam, but other than that, you can see that it's a very it tells the message that I think we should all intuitively and naturally understand. The China and U.S. are intertwined and interlinked. There is no way that one can win and the other one lose. Their fortunes are tied together. You kick China off the board, and the U.S. will sink as well. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So we're going to go ahead to Bob Wesser, and then we'll have an open discussion. Bob?
Okay, let me get my slides up here. Whoops. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great, okay. So just to pick up exactly where Dr. Koo left off, I mean, this actually is the history of the U.S.-China partnership. From the very beginning, it's been a historic collaboration, a win-win collaboration of the United States and China for the good of mankind and against empire. And of course, specifically, it's been the British Empire. And every great American patriot has represented that view, whether it be Benjamin Franklin, as you see on the left, Lincoln in the middle. You can also add FDR in this, Kennedy in his own way, and of course, Lyndon LaRouche in the most recent period, which we'll talk about a little bit. I have to start with this because, in my view, this man, Leibniz, is the philosophical founder, if you will, of the United States, of the ideas of the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. And his view was the future of civilization was bringing together what he calls the two extremes of the continent. You have Europe and the advancement of European civilization, and this great civilization in East China. And these two distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, and in between they bring everybody up to a better way of life. And this is, and I want just keep this in mind, keep this idea in mind as we go through this, because all great Americans, real patriots, understood this. And Dr. Koo was hinting at this with the idea of the China trade and going west, and that absolutely is correct. You know, continue to go west so we can get to Asia. Benjamin Franklin was a student of Confucius. He published, parts of Confucius in his in his Pennsylvania newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. It is a Philadelphia newspaper. He was specifically interested in this question that Dr. Koo also addressed, the idea of meritocracy. That in China, your power doesn't descend like kings and queens, to your primogeniture, but honor ascends. That is, from learning, wisdom, you can ascend to become to the rank of Mandarin. So it's through your deeds, through your
development as an individual. And this was very appealing. Franklin wasn't the only one. Madison also had some understanding of this from Confucius. And they thought this was a great idea. And obviously that's embedded in the Declaration of Independence. So after the revolution, aside from the tea trade that Dr. Koo was discussing, something else occurred, which is that you had some of the staunchest patriots immediately after the revolution organized this organization called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And the idea was, now that we beat the British Empire, let's go out across the globe and touch base with cultures and nations and powers, etc., to make alliances and collaborative efforts. It's important that all of the people that you see here were staunch anti-slavery patriots. They fought tooth and nail to stop slavery and block the slave trades during the Constitutional Convention. John Jay was the founder of the American Manumission Society, the Anti-Slavery Society. That's important, and you'll see why as we move on here. The founder of this organization, Jedediah Morse, and this is important to think about, because they saw the Native Americans as a great resource to be developed for the further development in the cultural, intellectual, and economic development of the nation. And you can see what he says here, right? He says that the mental quality of Native Americans are not in the least inferior to those of the Europeans. They are capable of even the most abstract sciences. And if equal care was taken of their education, we would see rise among the Native Americans philosophers, mathematicians, divines who would rival the first of Europe. So this was their view, completely opposed to this faction, this kind of pro-British faction of Andrew Jackson and company that came in later, that carried out the Indian removal and the genocide that you generally hear about now. But the actual patriots, Morse, Hamilton, these people had a completely different view. They even created, as you can see here, an alphabet for the Cherokee Indian tribe. And so they went out across the world, into Africa, into China, into the Middle East, East Asia, Japan. And I'm going to focus here on the two most important Americans that went to China in the 19th century. On the left is David Abele, and I'm going to talk about him more than the other guy. The guy on the right is important mainly because he embarked on, with Chinese around the Shanghai area, a whole project to translate all of Confucius into English for the American public. And unfortunately, he was murdered, probably by the British, but I don't have proof of that. So David Abele, on the other hand, went to Fujian province and met the governor of Fujian, which is Xu Jiyu. And Xu Jiyu was a Confucian scholar, one of the top Confucian scholars of China at the point. He was Han Chinese. And of course, remember, this is the Qing dynasty. So the Qing dynasty is a foreign, not non-Chinese, from Manchuria dynasty that's kind of running the country at this point, and not doing a very good job of it, as the British are coming in, and you have the opium flooding in, and it's really somewhat of a mess. But what does Abele do? He comes in and he says, look, let me tell you what the world is right now. And he basically gives Xu Ji a whole briefing of what the globe is and how the American Revolution has transformed the world. We beat the biggest empire. And Xu Jiyu, out of all this back and forth, they produced the first modern Chinese language atlas, which you can see a facsimile of here. And of course, then atlases are not just maps, but they're whole descriptions. It's really a whole encyclopedia of what the present state of the world is. And who's Xu Jiyu's hero? George Washington. After being told by Abele what the Americans did, how we beat the biggest empire in the world. He says, wow, this is great. Of course, look at when the date is when this is published. It's 1848, right? So this is right in the height of the Opium War attack on China by the British. So this is a very fruitful alliance. Now, this is really what I want to kind of get across here, because this is the kind of the guts of the whole thing. What's going on at that point is the British Empire is essentially on a rampage for total world domination. And this is their free trade system of the 19th century. What is it? You have cotton, raw produced cotton by the slave states in the United States. And they produce basically 75% of all cotton in the world at that point. That's then exported to Britain with cheap labor, which, you know, of Charles Dickens fame. This is produced into textiles, finished textiles, which then are sent to India, and the Indians pay for this with opium, and then the British sell the opium to China. That's their system. That's their slave system. It's based on slave labor in the United States. It's based on slave labor in England, and it's based on a total destruction of China. Buy cheap, sell dear. This is Abraham Lincoln's chief economist, Henry Carey, who in 1850 wrote a document called The Slave Trade, Domestic and Foreign, Why It Exists, and How It May Be Extinguished. And I'm just going to read this. He says, whatever tends to increase the quantity of raw produce forced on the market of England tends to be the cheapening of labor and land everywhere, to the perpetuation of slavery, and to the extension of its domain, and that whatever tends to the withdrawal of such produce from that market tends to the raising value of land and labor everywhere, to the extinction of slavery and to the elevation of man. The system, commonly called free trade, tends to produce these results. And where man is enslaved, there can be no real freedom of trade. By adopting the free trade or British system, we place ourselves side by side with the men who have ruined Ireland and India and are now poisoning and enslaving the Chinese people. So it was absolutely crystal clear among the anti-slavery Lincoln Republicans that this system had to be broken, and the United States had to break with it definitively. Now, the British thought the same thing. And they basically went on a rampage in the mid-19th century with Lord Palmerston as the foreign minister. And basically their idea was, we have to eliminate any opposition. So what do? They launched the Crimean War against Russia to humiliate Russia, which does work, but of course it caused a reaction. The Second Opium War. This is the burning of the Summer Palace by the French and the British in 1860. And of course, they provoked their slave labor colony, the Confederate States of America, which is what it was, to launch an insurrection, which you see here with the firing upon Fort Sumter, against the Federal Republic. So they go on a complete attack against Russia, China, and the United States at the same time. And the American patriots knew this very, very well. Lincoln allies with Tsar Alexander II. The Russians send over their navy to threaten to blockade or booster the blockade of the southern ports. Lincoln sends one of his top abolitionists, Anson Burlingame, who is actually from upstate New York. He was a fierce abolitionist, and he ended up moving to Massachusetts. He was a congressman, senator in Massachusetts. But he's sent to China to basically bolster up China and be the Lincoln's representative, the Lincoln people's representative to the Qing Empire. And I won't go through all the details of this slide, but we obviously win the Civil War against the slave system. And what happens is that one of the top priorities and Lincoln is of course assassinated, but of the people around Lincoln, is to ensure that there is a sovereign, recognized Chinese nation. it's called an empire, but still a nation. And that's the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. And it basically says China has most favored nation status with the United States. It should be recognized by governments as a sovereign country, not to be colonized, etc. And I want to just point out this little section which says, and this is important because they saw the fate of China and Chinese civilization as tied to the same battle in the United States. So one commentary on the treaty is, while slavery existed in the United States, the Senate would not have ratified a national covenant which accords so freely the rights of equal humanity and equal civilization to a tawny race not of European blood. And you can say, well, boy, that's the truth. Until we annihilated slavery in the United States, this was not really going to happen, and it did happen. Then Burlingame took a a mission, took a delegation of the Chinese government, imperial government, to capitals around the world, seeking to get recognition of the sovereignty of the Chinese government. Unfortunately, he died in Russia while doing this. It really kind of was never completed. This is one of the same missionaries out of the same operation that originally went to China. This was a very popular book in the post-Civil War America, the oldest, the newest empire, China and the United States. And in the book, it's a very long book talking about Chinese history, civilization. But he basically says the future of the world is exactly as Dr. Koo is saying today it should be, the alliance between China and the United States. This is the future of the human race, which of course is exactly what Leibniz was talking about back in whenever, 1700. Precisely the same idea. So, and there's meat to this. After the American Civil War, there's a whole participation by Americans in what's called the self-strengthening movement of China. We build the first arsenal in Jiangnan Arsenal near Shanghai. This is basically a technological center for the production of arms, cannons, etc., including this is basically a library of scientific and technological development. So this was the Americans doing this, or helping to do it. And then out of all of this comes the founder of modern China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who meets some of these Americans in Hawaii in the 1880s, who is a student of Lincoln and Hamilton, who has a complete understanding of this history, who writes this book here on the left called The Vital Problem of China, basically warning against the evils of the British Empire, that China should never ally with the British. And instead, what the world should do is carry out this wonderful, what he calls the international development of China, which is basically in-depth rail development and linking a modernized Chinese rail system with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, going all the way to Europe and then all the way to Cape Town, South Africa. So again, this is Leibniz. All right, link up China with the rest of the world, with the civilization in the West, lift everybody up, including in Africa in between. These are some of the Americans who work with Sun Yat-sen. I won't go through that just for time reasons. And then this is the thumbnail for the event today, and it shows the three principles of the people, which is based on Lincoln's Gettysburg Address idea of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this stamp, and again, this is the U.S.-China alliance, is produced in July 7th, 1942. It's called the 777 stamp. The Americans called it this. And why? Because the stamp was produced on July 7th, and that's the anniversary from 1937 of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was the Japanese aggression against China that started really started the Second World War, at least started the Second Sino-Japanese War. And it's obviously commemorating the alliance between the United States and China. And so just to kind of conclude all of this entire idea of Leibniz and these American patriots, Sun Yat-sen, is then really kind of in the United States brought to life by Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. That big red magazine you see in the center there is our Chinese language EIR from 1995 on the New Silk Road, 21st century Eurasian development. And on the left of that, you see our bringing back to life this whole idea of Sun Yat-sen's international development of China that was also in our EIR magazine. We produced the Eurasian Land Bridge Report in January 97. Below that is the conference on this Eurasian Land Bridge in Beijing, with Helga LaRouche was invited to speak to. And then on the bottom left, you see LaRouche and his wife Helga in Moscow. And the Russians were all for this from the get-go. In fact, they were the ones that told the LaRouches, hey, go to China, they'll love this too. Skip over that. And of course, this is really the core of what the Belt and Road Initiative is. It's exactly what Leibniz said. It's exactly what Sun Yat-sen was saying. It's exactly what all the real American patriots, the anti-empire patriots, promoted. Join East and West, lift everybody up in between, lift 850 million people out of poverty. And China and Russia are totally on board and working with this peacefully together. And that is really what we should be doing. Now, of course, you have an alternative, which is you can stick with the system that we have now, which is the Great Reset and, this globalization plan or policy of Prince Charles and depopulation in London and Wall Street. And, you get mass starvation, or if you don't starve to death, you can just die in your basement in Queens because the city of New York doesn't want to spend money to fix the infrastructure. Or we can just get incinerated in a nuclear war, which is what we're on the verge of. So obviously, most Americans, if they have a sense of the history and have an idea of what we can benefit from here, I think they're going to make the right choice, and that's what we have to bank on. I just have to end with this because, I mean, whenever you see this kind of stuff, like on the right, it just goes back to the kind of racist, hateful British garbage of the 19th century. And whenever you hear the anti-China stuff and this and that, that's all it is. It's nothing else. You might as well have the Confederacy speaking to you. Let's go back to the slavocracy of the South, because that's what all of this stuff is. And we should are better than that, and we should go beyond that as Americans. So anyway, I'll end with that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So now, Lainey and Richard, you may both have some thoughts. Maybe, Lainey, do you want to go first? And I think you might be muted, Lainey, or are you talking?
I want to do it for the dogs. So, yeah, but they're quiet now. No, I think if you think about China now, China is the hope for mankind. China was so poor. China went through a terrible 100 years of invasions, of colonizations and degradation. And they have shown the world, in particularly poor colonized or former colonized, which are still colonized nations, that if you're poor, you can do it. And I think this is one of the greatest impetus and concerning what is in between the lines, what China has done. And this is what the United States used to be. And I think it is indisputable. Well, maybe somebody will dispute it, but that the reason that there's been this massive anti-China and try to split up U.S. and China is because if U.S. and China goes together, the world will be a safe and great place for the future of mankind. Lyndon LaRouche said in 2002 at a conference in Los Angeles, he said, China and the United States are inseparable. Now they just need to get married. And the imperialists, they don't want that. They don't want to see that. And this is one point I wanted to make. Another one is that China has, in the United States, and it's cultural warfare against the United States, because young people today in the United States, they don't know the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and what it really means. They don't really know what America really is, because that has been destroyed by cultural warfare. In China, what has happened in the last years is that one of the greatest sons of China recently, of the young sons, is Sun Yat-sen, who was taken up. Hu Jintao, that was president at that time in 2011, had a big celebration of Sun Yat-sen's birthday. And he did it in 2011 because that was the 100 years anniversary of the revolution. And then Xi Jinping in 2016 had a big celebration of Sun Yat-sen too, where he said that we based our Belt and Road program of Sun Yat-sen's International Development of China that Bob mentioned. We based our Belt and Road on his program. And that's actually to say that is what we did in the Schiller Institute. We took Sun Yat-sen's program and just further developed it from where we are today. So people of a similar kind of thought for mankind come to the same conclusion. So it's not like we did it or China did it. Sun Yat-sen did it, but he did it based on what he had learned from Friedrich List, who was a German American. He studied Friedrich List with Radenau in Germany. And this is one thing I want to say, but also I want to stress what I think is so important regarding what the United States is not doing or what it needs to do. China is also taking up now reviving Confucius, and Sun Yat-sen loved Confucius and studied Confucius and used Confucius. Sun Yat-sen actually made his program for a constitution of China based upon that of the United States, plus he added a force, an arm called the Control Yan. But US and China are so much in a family of thought concerning United States being the first republic in the world founded upon principles of the posterity, of the taking care of the posterity, the general welfare. So where United States is a young nation, where China has great ancient, who said, of meristocracy, to combine such two nations together with the real foundations of the United States and the greatest thoughts of China, that is incongruous. And that's why there's such an effort to destroy China and destroy any Americans from loving to study China and so forth. I just think that I know there is a lot of growth among young people in the United States now to study Chinese. And I hope we can get more and more people-to-people exchanges, in particularly American young people going to China, because if they go there, they'll be, oh my God, that's what we should be doing. Anyway, that's just my short comments on what was said. But Confucius, take the best of China. Love is the highest, huh? And if you don't have love for your fellow man and for mankind, you are nothing. You cannot develop your all the potentials you're born with. So it's all there, and that's why there's such an intense attack and try to destroy the image of China from an epistemological, philosophical standpoint. And the British, they know it. Sun Yat-sen warned about that. He wrote a paper where he said, look, when there was a civil war brewing in China, he wrote a letter to the United States. Look, the British are trying to do what they did in the civil war in the United States. Come to help, because they want to split up China in several parts. So anyway, that's my comments. I could
Great,
say
thanks.
much more, but I have to shut up.
We'll have all day next time. Richard, what thoughts do you have?
I have two thoughts. Thank you, Diane. On this idea of China being a dangerous threat to the United States, China being suspicious, stealing our intellectual property, sending in spies, cameras in subway cars, as Dr. Koo mentioned. For any of our listeners who don't know anything about China or are suspicious of China or are scared of China, the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, said something quite interesting on this. She said, you know, if you consider a foreign nation and a foreign culture, and it's foreign to you and you don't know anything about it, well, why not study its history and its customs and its poetry and how its language works? And you'll find, if you give up your laziness and look into this in a serious way, that nation and culture will no longer be foreign. So for anybody watching who is scared of what's being presented tonight, don't be lazy. Look into the Schiller Institute, what Dr. Koo, Diane is putting forward, and you might fall in love with a very ancient civilization. That's number one. Secondly, just in terms of current history, the current president of China, President Xi, went into the lion's den about a week and a half ago. People know every year the Billionaires Club from London and Wall Street and Silicon Valley, they get together. This is called the Davos Group. And they gave themselves a super pompous name. I mean, it's a bunch of bankers, a bunch of banksters. They call themselves the World Economic Forum. Well, because of the prominence of China and what China is succeeding in doing, they had to invite the president of China to be the speaker on the first day. And what happened was President Xi, of course, very polite, but he said, "Well, look, I want you guys to think about a man who wants to catch a fish, and the way he goes about catching a fish is climbing a tree. Now, wouldn't you think that man is ignorant?" And then he went on to give them an economics lesson. He said that anybody that goes for prosperity and growth by depleting their current resources, well, this is like somebody so stupid as to drain a pond to get a fish. And anybody who would sacrifice the growth of their people for the environment, well, this is like someone who goes to fish by climbing a tree. And he was talking about these billionaires, their theory that the world has to shrink, that each baby born is another mouth we cannot feed, and that depopulation is the way to go. So in his very poetic way, he really dressed down these bankers and said, you guys are like a bunch of people who want to get a fish by climbing a tree. So what's happening is that the ideas of China, I mean, this idea that you have to have a people-centered policy, a people-centered policy. What does that mean? It means that the moral growth, the physical growth, the economic growth of a nation is primary. That's the first principle. And this is very much akin to one of the first principles of the economics of Lyndon LaRouche. One of his most famous books is called No Limits to Growth. And China is pursuing a path which really makes these billionaires look like a bunch of monkeys, even though they have a lot of destructive power. So China is definitely worth looking into.
Great. Well, I have to say, I was really happy to hear your, well, I shouldn't say happy, but it confirms my intention to end the political career of Chuck Schumer. Your discussion of him stopping the subway cars. And also, he's the sponsor of the Innovation and Competition Act, which I think just passed in the House today as well, which again, and I ran into this a couple nights ago where, I asserted that the person, I was at an event where someone else was speaking and he was saying that China is a terrible enemy and they're so dangerous. And I said, well, that's really not true. And they're not running concentration camps in Xinjiang and so on. And what about how they lifted all these people out of poverty? And the person said, well, yeah, they did that because Deng Xiaoping was a capitalist, but Xi Jinping is not. And no, it was really unbelievable. And then who was the last? It just, the argument was so ridiculous because he admitted that indeed China had lifted all these people out of poverty, but nonetheless, somehow this was a threat. Oh, and that the United States had to crush China. Now, when is that? That's like some horrible thing from grading on a curve where you can only be good if you can step on someone else's head, as opposed to the American idea of a harmony of interest that we rise and everybody rises. But George and Bob, what thoughts do you have on all of this?
Well, I mean, the zero sum approach that we seem to be taking, it's just a clearly a losing proposition. As you say, it's almost like the only way that the United States can rise above is to push China's head underwater. Yeah, and that's not a long-term solution because the Chinese are going to figure out how to get out from underwater and go and do their own thing. There's so much more to be gained if you work together and take advantage of the mutual strength that each has. I mean, there's lots of complementary strength that each has to offer to the other one, and there's no reason to engage in a lose-lose outcome because I can't say for sure who is going to lose more than the other side, but for sure both sides will lose, and the whole world will take a step backwards as a result.
I mean, the only thing I would, oh, can I be heard? Okay. The only thing I would add is that, I mean, and I'm sure people on this call have the same experience. When you actually talk to Americans one-on-one and just go through this stuff calmly, this anti-China stuff just disappears. It's not in our DNA. It really isn't, unless you're an extremely hateful person, and most people are not. They're struggling to survive. And there's, I'm reading a lot about John Kennedy now, and even in this horrible period of the Cold War, this idea of a good neighbor policy, we do something with other countries for the benefit of all. Exactly the counter of what Dr. Koo is saying with the zero-sum game. This is an American approach. This is what the country's founded on, across the board. We had to fight to preserve it, but ultimately that is what the soul of the United States is. So really, when we're fighting for this Chinese-American partnership, we're fighting for the soul of the United States. And I think if we see it from that standpoint, that's. I mean, you're absolutely right. If China goes down, I mean, Laney was saying, if China goes down, the U.S. goes down. I mean, that is, and vice versa, really, in a certain sense, which is kind of what we're seeing now.
But I think the dilemma is that the politicians and the mainstream media are so imbued with China is the bad guy, is the evil empire, is the villain, and we have to put them down, that it's totally saturated with the hate China message So it's very difficult for any politician of any with any statesman like stature and thinking about what's good for the country or what's good for the world to be able to step up and say, hey, what we are doing against China is wrong. It takes a lot of courage, and it puts his or her political career at risk because there's so much negative imagery, negative message out there to overcome.
That's why the campaign of Diane and others is so important,
Yeah.
because
That's exactly what I
this
was going to
is
say.
this, this is very much like in Hitler's Germany with Goebbels' propaganda. Normal Americans are not like that. It's just this, they got scared, and all the politicians are scared. The good, the better politicians, they are scared too, as you said. There's no, and they are not statesmen. If a statesman is scared, he's not a statesman or woman. He's just a little,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Diane, I'm glad I set you up for that one.
Yes, that was well done. That was well done. You'll have to come to New York and help with the campaign. Well, I have a couple of comments, and you may have some thoughts. Someone writes on YouTube, the reason we speak English in this meeting is because the British were once a superior civilization. Now, I think that's quite a leap and doesn't follow. But since Western civilization collapsed, China is superior now and is colonizing the world, which also is not happening. And then they also write the Japanese people are certainly afraid of China. I mean, if they're afraid, they should be afraid because of what they did to China earlier. But because they saw during the lifetime of China getting more powerful than Japan in 2 or 3 years, the Chinese military will be more powerful than the American. Does anyone want to?
Let me say something.
Yeah.
Let me say something about Japan. The Japanese people are not afraid of China. The Japanese political structure is terrified of London and Washington, D.C. Nothing comes out of the Japanese government unless it's approved out of Washington, D.C. and London. So in terms of the actual Japanese civilization or culture, it is not anti-Chinese, but you have a Japanese government which has essentially been a puppet of the Anglo-Americans since World War II. So there's an ambivalence, and that Japanese thing could definitely change as Asia emerges as the driver of history. And let me also say, what's happened in the last week is breathtaking. This integration of the Russian civilization, which is 1,000 years old, and Chinese civilization, the best scholars in China call China a civilizational state. This is amazing. This disproves all the British geopolitical manure. You have Russia, a Western, sort of European, Eastern Orthodox Christian nation, and China, an Asian 5,000-year-old Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist civilization integrating around creating a new kind of future. This completely blows the geopolitical theories of the British smithereens. And what you have is a new entity, this China-Russia combination. And the West can't deal with it. As my wife was joking the other day, speaking about the Anglo-Americans, she said, well, it's clear now that the emperor has no clothes. He also doesn't have any hypersonic weapons.
I go one better. I think Secretary of State Blinken, he goes around the world wearing a hospital gown, but he doesn't know that his backside's exposed. But I want to address, Diane, I want to address the comment that sent in about how the Chinese are taking over the world.
Yes.
Let me point out, the way they're taking over the world is building highways and railroads and ports and airports and others and helping those countries develop economically. But very importantly, they do not send any of their soldiers to those countries that they're helping. Maybe a few from a security point of view, but they do not occupy and they do not participate in the local government. That's a very lousy way of taking over the world.
Yeah, and Dr. Koo, I'm really happy you said, Lyndon LaRouche was very emphatic that the way you create friends, he talked about the United States, is that you go out and you help develop other nations. And that's how you create real lasting
Right.
friendship. And that's what China is doing now. Yeah.
And common prosperity that way.
Yeah.
Indeed.
But I think also what you said, Dr. Koo, is this, that the real America, and that's what I think we have here in America to get to people, the real principles of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the principles upon which the United States was founded upon, that if you talk with it, because it's all made up. China, anti-China, US, it's all made up. And therefore, it's up to us to define the higher levels of what was the idea about the founding of the United States. What was these people actually doing against the British Empire, fighting them and creating a republic? And that is why the United States and China should collaborate today. So Americans don't know, or they are scared. But I think it's very important that we really talk to Americans. Who are we all about? China is doing what the United States used to do. We should join. We should be China, US, China. We should just join in this common effort to develop the world. Let's develop the world together.
Yeah.
So think about it
and we
in
can
a way. Yeah.
We can save a lot of trouble if we do that. We won't have to have any planes falling off the aircraft carrier. We don't have to have any nuclear submarine running into mountains and getting their nose bloodied. And there's lots of reasons why the way we're going now is against our own national interests. And we just have to keep getting this message out to the American people, because we can't rely on the mainstream media, and we cannot rely on the mainstream politicians to say the right thing and do the right thing, unfortunately.
And we have this beautiful world with all these people in it that we have to develop. All the babies are bound to be born, and we can have such a great world. What Confucius, with the Da Tong, what he said about the future ideal society, right? Where you don't have to lock your door, where the old people are taken care of, the children are taken care of. Yeah. So, and that goes. This is like in the. This is embedded in the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. The Da Tong. It's right there. Think about it. It's similar, right?
Yeah.
Don't you agree, Dr.? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lane, I want to pick up on something you said before, because it's important for people listening to know. We're finding that among young Americans, age 30 and younger, there's tremendous interest in China. It's different from the population at large. In the Schiller Institute, we're recruiting new young members in their 20s, in their 30s. We're recruiting dozens of teenagers who are watching our videos about these ideas. And I had a funny experience about a year ago. I made a very short videotape, put it up on YouTube. The title was "What's Really Happening in China?" And I discussed the brilliance of the current 14th five-year plan in China around technological innovation and aesthetic education. And within a few weeks, it had 22,000 views. And this was mostly among young people, batting around on social media. So it's important to keep that in mind. While the politicians seem, beyond being saved, young America is totally excited about these ideas and the hope that this represents?
Well, I think the message to the young people is China is where the future is, and for the young people, that's important consideration. I mean, there's so much more possibility if they go to China and be exposed to the culture and the history and the way they think in China. Even if they just go there for 6 months and a year and come back, they will be so much more beneficial to their entire world outlook and education.
Optimism.
That's true.
Yep.
Yes, based on one's activity and intent. So we're wrapping up on time. One of our viewers, I think, is celebrating the Chinese New Year with Chinese fortune cookies, and she wanted to share the 2 fortunes that she got. She writes, I don't think she's making it up, but it just shows we're on the right path. Her first fortune was, sometimes travel to new places leads to great transformation. And the second one was, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance. So
I do want to point out, though, that the Chinese fortune cookie was invented in San Francisco.
That's right.
okay, showing again the importance of U.S.-China collaboration, because who knows what we'll come up with next. And it certainly beats nuclear war. So I would like to thank all of you for joining me and participating in this. I sincerely hope we can prevent the current insane trajectory of our U.S. senators from blowing up the world. And I would like to let people know that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, the LaRouche organization is hosting a program where these ideas and the philosophy behind them will be further developed, and people should tune in. And I would like to encourage, there was a viewer who was not in the United States who was frustrated that I did not, my campaign website, it doesn't say until the very bottom that you can't donate unless you're a U.S. citizen or a green card holder. That is true, and unlike certain candidates I know, I am not going to violate the law. So if you are a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, this campaign needs funds. Please donate. Also, if you're in New York, I urgently need volunteers because, as we've been discussing, the petitioning requirement has been made absurd. The powers that be wish to silence independent voices. And there will be a meeting for all New York petitioners on Sunday. So please sign up at Diane Sare, Sare for Senate, sareforsenate.com. And if you're not a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, you may visit the schillerinstitute.com, the LaRouche organization.com, or subscribe to LaRouche's magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, at LaRouchePub.com. And I put some of those in the chat. But thank you, everyone. So let's go ahead and make this truly a year of a tiger.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
Yeah.